Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for July 6th, 2022. Today I want to concentrate on some developments taking place within the United Kingdom around what you might call the rise and demise of Boris Johnson. And this is relevant because of the role the British continue to play internationally in shaping U.S. policy as well as global policy. This is going on despite the fact that the situation within the United Kingdom is deteriorating rapidly, with strikes threatened, with economic crisis, and yet the British are moving into what could be a new regime, but with the same policy, which is to promote what is called Global Britain as a centerpiece of global NATO. Now, I'm going to rely heavily on a very insightful article published by the Grey Zone's Kit Clarenberg, which appeared in Consortium News on May 18th, which is subtitled A Very British Coup. Now, this is quite important given what's going on in the last couple of days within the United Kingdom. The latest scandal of another set of lies from Boris Johnson, another attempt at cover-up of those lies, and then, of course, some apologies, and then the hope that it will all go away. Only this time, we've seen the resignation of top cabinet officials, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sunak, who's one of the people who is being discussed as a replacement for Johnson. Now, what's the issue here? I mean, Boris Johnson lied around his parties at Downing Street when everything else in Britain was locked down. There are many other of these kinds of scandals, but the most scandalous of all is left out of the discussion, namely his role in continuing to insist that Zelensky and Ukraine not negotiate or engage in diplomatic settlement with Russia, and instead that NATO continue pouring in arms as his top defense officials are talking about Britain entering a land war in Europe. So while none of that is in the British tabloids, what's important to do is look at the way policy is made to get a sense of how they do this. And the story from Clarenberg is based on leaked emails and documents related to the plan that was successful in bringing down Theresa May, allegedly over her approach to Brexit. Now, the article identifies what the author describes as a cabal of wealthy financiers and representatives of the military and defense establishment and the intelligence establishment. And at the center of that was Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former head of MI6. Dearloffe is someone who was responsible for the so-called intelligence of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which led to the decision to invade Iraq. And when it was, these documents were presented by Tony Blair to George W. Bush that allegedly showed that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction. But Dearloffe continues to be active. He was one of the key figures behind Christopher Steele and the dirty dossier that was used to launch Russiagate. Now, also involved in this was someone named Gwythian Prinz, who I'm sure very few people have ever heard of. He's a member of the Defense Staff's Strategy Advisory Panel and a former NATO advisor. Now, Brexit was ostensibly the issue in this coup and how to handle it, and the opposition to May's attempt to have a soft Brexit. But what Clarenberg identifies as the real underlying issue was the attempt to strengthen what he describes as the security relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain, between London and Washington, the so-called special relationship. The idea was that this was threatened by the way Brexit was being handled, and you needed someone who would be able to reinsure the British role in directing U.S. policy, and Boris Johnson was selected to do that. Now, there are many details. For example, one email explicitly states that the goal is, if necessary, to remove the prime minister. Later, Prinz wrote to Dearloffe, quote, "Now kill her and it," referring to the soft Brexit plan. But underlying this, as I said, was the concern to protect the Five Eyes spying operation, the global spying operation, the same operation that was behind the Russiagate story. And the same agency, which includes the US, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia, which is behind the attempt to destroy Russia and contain China. Now, that's why you have to look at Boris Johnson and his role in manipulating Zelensky, shaping the NATO response to the war with Russia, and see that this is the way the British operate, the way they manipulate, the way they control the narrative, the way they shape the psychological reactions to events in the real world by focusing on other aspects. Now, Dearloff's role in this was not only to be involved in running the coup against May, but he was the chief security advisor to Boris Johnson during this whole period. Now, Klarenberg notes at the end of the article that they're now moving against Johnson, that he's now expendable, and that among the people they're looking at to replace him is Liz Truss, the war minister. She's actually the foreign secretary, but she's the one who's most vehement in her opposition to Putin and Russia and the continuation of the war. Now, remember, Brexit was originally based on opposition to European Union policy, and there was a legitimacy to it. But what we also see here is the extent to which the British establishment thought that global Britain and global NATO would be undermined by being tethered to the European Union and the need to break that. And Johnson was the person who was sent in as the wrecking ball to make sure that the British had an independent policy of the European Union over and above the Union to be able to manipulate and control things. So the concern was the threat to the US-UK special relationship. This article shows how policy is made and pushed through by the United Kingdom. It sheds light on the rise and demise of Boris Johnson. And it also reminds us that this is the same network that was involved in the anti-Trump movement known as Russiagate. Now, where's the City of London fit in on all of this? Well, the city had one concern with Brexit, which is that would this end the special relationship that the city had with European finance? Because the City of London handles almost the entirety of European banks' clearinghouse when it comes to derivatives contracts and these special financial instruments that are at the heart of the speculative bubble that's threatening to crash down on the whole world economy. But the City of London got an exemption that even with the removal or the leaving of Brexit by the British, that the City of London would still maintain that role as the last resort transaction determination of all of these financial instruments in the European Union. So they would be willing to accept either way, Brexit or non-Brexit. So the other question then was this relationship with the United States. Could the British cement more closely the relationship with the United States as they're prepared to launch global Britain as the new face of the empire and global NATO? That's the underlying issue, the issue of war and peace, the issue of whether there'll be cooperation between nations or whether there will continue to be division and blocks, that you have to join one block or the other. And that's what the fight is. So in looking at this, keep in mind that there is an alternative to this kind of so-called realpolitik, which is nothing more than geopolitics aimed at war and the use of war and economic blackmail to keep nations under the control of this Anglo-American financial empire. That's why we're mobilizing for the establishment of a new Bretton Woods conference to take up a new security and new financial architecture out from under the control of the City of London and out from under these Byzantine political maneuvers that serve the interests of the handful of people of the City of London and their allies against the interests of the rest of the world. The world is changing. The attempt to replace Boris Johnson by someone else is not part of that change. It's to suppress that change. And at this point, it now becomes absolutely crucial that the American people understand the broader strategic issues involved and become a part of the solution by working together to create a new Bretton Woods system, along with countries such as Russia, China, India, the nations of the global South, which have had it with global Britain. What about us? Are we going to remain part of an American beast on a British leash to impose this new global order? Or will we reassert the traditions of the American Revolution? So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.